Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this webinar. I am glad that you all have joined us today for this amazing lecture. And I hope all of you are at home and safe with your family during this pandemic crisis across the globe. Also, I would like to welcome ma'am today with us. So, ma'am, we welcome you today on board. We have Professor Rashmi Raman with us, who is a associate professor and assistant director at the Center of International Legal Studies at Jindal Global Law School. Her topic for today's webinar is going to be critical approaches to transitional justice, which might be a very new topic for a lot of people here in the attendees, but I'm sure you will definitely love and enjoy her lecture. Also, I would like to inform all the attendees that after her session, I'll be taking the questions from you, and we're going to answer the same. Thank you, ma'am. We welcome you here today. I would like to give you the platform to speak further for the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Gupta, and welcome to all of the young colleagues and students and scholars from across the country and other parts of the world who have taken the effort to join us here today. Despite the limitations of technology, I'm pleased to have an opportunity to speak about a topic on which I have done a considerable amount of work. My own career has been in international criminal law, and during this time, before I came into academia, I was acutely conscious of the overlaps between international humanitarian law, human rights law, and the institutionalized response mechanism created by international criminal law. And I think it was the interface between these three quite distinct, but at the same time, overlapping areas of academic inquiry that got me interested in exploring transitional justice, not only as an evolving area of specialization in public international law since the 1980s. It has been so, but also to really inquire into what is it that transitional justice can offer students and scholars of international law like myself who identify politically as children and grandchildren of the post-colony in the global south and who have for large parts of their collective imagination and intergenerational understanding of resistance developed an aversion to institutionalized forms of Western neoliberal hegemonic systems of justice that have come to dominate any epistemological understanding of post-conflict justice, really. So how I think I would like to begin is by sharing with you a little anecdote about the time that I spent as a young scholar visiting Rwanda. At the time that I made my field trip to Rwanda, it was part of a conference that I was presenting a paper at. And my institutional affiliation at that time was with the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which, as many of you know, is in fact in Tanzania and not in Rwanda. So I had to travel to a different country to visit Rwanda. And during my trip, I was amazed to see sites of, incredible countryside and so forth, but also working in the countryside, there were these men and women in pink overalls who were quite distinct against the green landscape. And as the bus drove on, I saw no fewer than dozens of these men and women who were working fields, engaged in public work of some kind. At the time, I wondered, who they were, but I assumed that they were municipal workers, something like that. And then I came across lots of important academic work in understanding the role of the Rwandan local justice system, or the Gacaca courts, in delivering grassroots justice to those who had been identified as chief perpetrators in some of the worst crimes that constituted the Rwandan genocide of 1995. I realized then that it was the Gacaca courts, which are local sort of, Gacaca means under the tree in Kenya, Rwanda. And it's an informal assembly of community elders who have gathered together to hear cases against an accused. And the punishment that they gave out was usually to serve in the community and to be visible. And I think that looking back at this example, I realized what a powerful symbol of restorative justice it is to watch the perpetrators of the worst crime that your community has ever faced on a daily basis, trying to integrate back into that community by giving physical labor, by giving of themselves in the form of physical labor, by being so visible in the countryside, not locked up in a prison somewhere where nobody ever sees them. And there must be so many associations with seeing the faces that have been capable of committing terrible crimes, really. But they go about their usual work, and you see them every day. So this, to me, really illustrates the gap between where I used to work, which is the institutionalized, also really, evolved and sophisticated mechanism of justice. That was the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda in Arusha. And 2 or 3 features of the tribunal are worth noting in this context. One, that it was not in Rwanda. It was in fact in Tanzania. And so there is this dislocation and accompanying dissociation from the scene of the atrocity, which gives the tribunal a certain amount of distance, distance from the atrocity, distance from the people whose reality was that genocide. And more, if you sit and think about it, the way that transitional justice has evolved, it is in a series of institutionalized responses to post-conflict atrocities. Now, it can be post-conflict reconstruction, but what kind of reconstruction, right? Reconstruction could be social reconstruction. It could be an economic reconstruction. It could be an institutional reconstruction where the rule of law mechanisms in a state have crumbled, and the state is in fact transitioning from an autocratic or a dictatorial regime into a democratic system. And so what undergoes the transition then is from one form of legitimized government to another. All of the mechanisms that accompany that transition, right? These are the mechanisms that really tend to fascinate us who are scholars and who are sort of looking in from outside, because we have the perspective, the happy perspective of not making that awful reality of conflict our own. It isn't our own, and so we have the distance, we have the amplitude that comes with looking in from outside. So really, since the 1980s, transitional justice has emerged as a really important part of the conversation on humanitarian law. It started in Latin American states, but really the momentum got going, and largely by the 1990s, by the mid-1990s, when the 2 terrible genocides of the 20th century unfolded before us in Yugoslavia and in Rwanda, the international community was put in a tight spot to come up with some tough answers and some answers that would sort of compensate for the lack of action, the lack of attention that the international community is accused of in these countries. So one of the features of the 1980s, the 1990s, and the emerging conversation on transitional justice was that it was good. And I say that, I say that quite deliberately. It's a simple word, but it carries a great deal of pith with it, because what came to be known as transitional justice was that here are a set of international institutions, agencies, under alliances formed by the United Nations, peacekeeping operations, coalitions of other sovereign states. It came to be normalized. And what came to be normalized, as students of international law will know, the rule for territorial sovereignty has always been that territorial integrity and political independence are the hallmarks of a sovereign state. So Articles 2.4 and 2.7 of the United Nations Charter that guarantee this, they are seen as the rule, whereas the mechanisms under Chapter 7, Articles 42 to 49, especially Article 51, are seen as an exception to that rule. So when you intervene in the domestic affairs, specifically when you intervene in the territory of a sovereign state, you are seen as doing something that is the exception. But with post-conflict reconstruction, intervention became not the exception, but the rule. Because this intervention is humanitarian intervention. It is for a good cause. It is to protect and uphold and rebuild human rights. And it received such a momentous fillip in 2005 under the Secretary General's report on state sovereignty that it took on a life of its own. Responsibility to protect emerged as a doctrine that is here to stay, which is alive and well today. And part of R2P are the pillars of predicting, rebuilding, restoring, and so on. So really, transitional justice came to define the part of conflict that we never knew much about. You know, we knew that the Geneva Conventions existed during conflict. We knew that certain rules of customary law and a reading of the Charter existed before conflict, which would dictate whether or not or how to engage in conflict. But we never knew what are the rules that apply post-conflict. And so this part of international law, the so-called jus post bellum, is the space that came to be completely occupied and animated by mechanisms of humanitarian intervention, by UN agencies that were trying to reconstruct societies, rebuild human rights, sort of, evangelist proselytizing missions. That this is, of course, the critical approach. This is where I'm getting into it, but you try and reimagine what could exist in the ashes of a broken society, in a war-torn society. You try and think of what could it look like, and that ideal, I suggest to you that the ideal of what a state should look like came very much to resemble a certain formulaic, one-size-fits-all kind of response to these horrendous atrocities in different parts of the world. Just to give you an example of how this works in practice, let's take the example of truth commissions. Truth and reconciliation commissions are a very important and one of the oldest transitional justice mechanisms. And in South Africa, where they were launched by with the support of really prominent social leaders like Archbishop Tutu, and with the power of the Christian, with the power of the church really behind these missions. And one cannot discount the fact that there was a powerful religious motivation for this, and that in that society, the religious motivation spoke to the people. And so when they used a tool like remorse or forgiveness, they were speaking very much to Christian values. And perhaps it is for those reasons that that mechanism took off in that society and did really well. So as you know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for its efforts at rebuilding post-apartheid South Africa. And its architects at the time, perhaps they did not imagine the kind of success that this which at that time was a kind of innovative attempt at trying to fix a society that was broken by asking people to come forward and tell the truth. Perhaps they didn't think how successful it would be, but it was a runaway success. And subsequent commissions, that is, commissions of individuals who were tasked to prepare a toolkit to address similar, but really not so similar post-conflict situations, started applying the idea of a truth commission. And so there have been, several examples where this has been a bit of a, obviously it has failed. And one of the examples that I can give you where it simply didn't take off was Nepal. The junta government in Nepal, the communist government, after there was a coup that overthrew them and so forth. But politically, there was a reconstruction effort in Nepal. And by that time, the 2005 Secretary General report, the 2004 Secretary General report on peace building had been published, which contained, among other things, a very controversial document. This is the document that today we call the Transitional Justice Toolkit. And the toolkit really is a codex of all of the things that have worked in different parts of the world at different points in time. And the reason that they have all been crystallized and codified and put into a toolkit is obviously in the hope that we can replicate the success of these post-conflict measures wherever there is something to be fixed. So, you have this toolkit, which is literally that. You look for something to repair a society, you take it, you apply it, and you hope to replicate those results. Except that the process, it doesn't always take. There is this idea of, nidation. We borrow this from biology. Nidation is the idea that when you place something in a petri dish, the cells around it have to accept it. It has to organically fit in as a solution that responds to that crisis. And only then can you hope that there will be an outcome. And without this kind of organic association with the reality of that post-conflict situation, you can't hope to achieve the results. And more, I think that when we think of what are some mainstream transitional justice mechanisms, we look at truth and reconciliation commissions. We look at the idea of lustration, that is the removal of, lustration is once again a word that we borrow from, pearl culturing, which is that you remove the top layer of the bureaucracy with the assumption that that is the rotten layer which was responsible for whatever conflict that went on. So you lustrate that layer and you hope that whatever remains under it, you give a chance to new bureaucrats to come in. More and more, there are these, so other mechanisms include, for example, forgiving, which is one of the hallmarks of many transitional justice mechanisms, where you come before some kind of a committee, some kind of a body, and you make a full declaration of the wrongs that you think you have committed, and that's it. You're given, you're given a pardon, and that pardon is with impunity. which means that you're also protected from future prosecutions for that same crime which you have just essentially confessed to having done. And then there are more creative mechanisms like asking for an apology, erecting some kind of a monument, and culturally coming together to document what happened. So that part of it, right? The narrative of telling the story of what really happened in that society, I think that's a hallmark of modern transitional justice mechanisms, which is trying to fix the problems with historic revisionism, which happened at the time of, say, the largest genocide, genocide committed by the Ottoman Empire. There's no record of it because of historic revisionism. Texts were rewritten or overwritten, and a great deal of information has been lost in that process. And perhaps to remedy in good faith, to remedy in good faith the kinds of problems that existed with a biased retelling of history or a retelling of history from the victor's perspective. We have the idea of mechanisms whose job is to record the narrative, to keep a record of what really went on in these societies and who were the parties that were affected and so on. But the ownership of that story, no matter how painful that story is, it is a story of human suffering. It is a story of displacement, of lost dreams, lost opportunities, lost families, lost jobs. I remember when I was working at the tribunal in Cambodia in Phnom Penh, one of the things I noticed about Cambodian society at the time was that there were no older people. The generation of parents and grandparents, they were nowhere to be found. And one of my Cambodian friends told me later at the tribunal that they are the lost generation. You see, they're gone. They all went to the camps, and hardly any of them came back. So when the loss is so deep, it's so all-pervasive. It changes the identity of the generation that comes in later. It's impossible really for us to reduce it to an incident in history and to give it a place among other terrible incidents in history and say, you know what, we are done. We have applied the transitional justice toolkit, and now you, as a society, are ready to move forward. And I think this is the part, this is the point at which scholarship makes you want to squirm, because you're looking on the one hand at the untold atrocities that different regimes, and the more you travel in the world, the more you see of the world, the more exposure you get to the specificities of the mechanisms of atrocities perpetrated by different regimes at different points in time. But you start asking questions of, well, what is the objective? What is the objective of a criminal court here? What does it do? And as an international criminal lawyer, I think that having these courts is a tremendously important part of answering the question of impunity. Can you get away with having committed such terrible crimes? That's the question that, that's the position that international criminal law takes off from, that there should be an end to impunity, and that we need to institutionalize a response to atrocities. One of the ways to institutionalize the response is to harmonize harmonize the rules, and then identify the breaches of that rules as being all in one pattern. And that's really this is the enterprise of international criminal law. We now have a permanent court of for individual criminal responsibility, the ICC, and then you have, of course, the large network of international criminal courts and tribunals, each of which has jurisdiction over temporal jurisdiction and also subject matter jurisdiction according to the atrocity that was committed and the place and who committed it, etc. But I think that somewhere in the narrative of us putting our collective weight, and by us I mean the international community, and who are the conscience keepers really of these institutionalized response to atrocities. I think that one of the problems with it is that we've become quite, we've become quite self-congratulatory. The fact that we have, after a great deal of political opposition, been able to launch an international criminal court is celebrated, and rightly so, because it really was an incredibly difficult series of compromises resulting in a product that really is only half as wonderful as what they were starting out to achieve at the Rome Conference because of all of the compromises that were made along the way. But sure, having an institution that has predictability, that has jurisdiction over a crime before that crime is committed, this is the idea of law. You have an offense, you know that there is an institution that has jurisdiction to prosecute those who are responsible for having committed that offense. It creates stability, predictability, and this is the basic idea of retributive justice. Right? We have our criminal justice systems in every country. We have penal provisions, we have the police, we have the law enforcement agencies and so on. And their idea is sometimes, retributive, sometimes restitutive, but it's, most of the time it functions somewhere in between. But when you take on the role, which is almost the role of, you're a guardian of the interim process, the process which is the twilight phase between the destruction of a state and the re-emergence of a new state from the ashes of that old state. There is also a tremendous responsibility that the international community has towards the people of that society. And I think that despite all of its, tremendously powerful and harmonized institutional mechanisms, the problem with the transitional justice toolkit is that it doesn't necessarily permit for customization to fit each conflict. Now, what are the reasons for this? I mean, the biggest reason is a resource problem. It's not as if conflicts come with a tremendous amount of warning, and it's not like each situation comes with its own group of experts who are able to deliver a customized solution to that conflict. It's always that there is a compromise that is made between the available resources, the end outcome that you're seeking to achieve, and the thing to which you have committed your loyalty, and that is the toolkit, that you are able to apply your expertise. There are specialists now in transitional justice who happen, sometimes they are from the academia, sometimes they are from international organizations. Most of the time, they are doing a tightrope act because they are members of all of this. You have the same set of academics, international actors, institutionally recognized specialists who are curating these packages, and they do so with the best of intentions, etc. But more often than not, unless it is a bottom-up response to atrocity, it's highly unlikely to be a holistic response. It's highly unlikely to answer questions like specific gender-based violence crimes that take place in one society, which may in character, form, and substance be very different from gender-based violence that is institutionally recognized or recognized in the mainstream toolkit of transitional justice. The limitations of the toolkit, of course, are not simply revealed by crimes that are crimes of gender-based violence. It's also revealed in economic crimes, everyday injustices. It's also revealed, I think, most tellingly in whether that society is able to stop itself from relapsing into conflict. And In Colombia, for example, the peace agreement that was signed between the government and the representatives of the FARC, um, when that agreement came through in the summer of 2016, it was a momentous occasion in the history of Colombia because on the face of it, it appeared as if Colombia had turned a corner. It was a homegrown sense of justice. It was a homegrown sense of vindication because it was the Colombian state on its own which solved its problems with the FARC. Except that the jubilation was short lived. Colombia then went into economic distress. It went into a crisis of leadership. It went into questions of democratic deficit, questions of legitimacy crisis in the governance, which all of which resulted in a future for Colombia that was very far from stable, which no one could have predicted at the time of the agreement with FARC. The same kind of thing happened in Bolivia with their peacekeeping, peace building operations. When they fell through, it was a race for whom to blame. Do we blame the government? Do we blame the international peacekeeping agents? Do we blame the organizations that have settled down here for a few years now and are helping us transit? To an extent, the United Nations has taken the brunt of the blame for this, and that might have to do with their peculiar practice of naming their administrative measures that are an interim administration between the state that has lapsed and the state that is yet to be born. The example that comes to my mind at this point is the East Timor example. You see, they call themselves the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, or UNTAET. And there is a small joke that a former professor of mine told us about the alphabet soup crisis of the United Nations. They have so many peacekeeping operations: UNMIC, UNMISS, UNMIL, UNTAET, UNMOGIP in India. So many of them that they're running out of how to name these missions. Because it has to all start with the United Nations, and what do you follow it up with? Jokes apart, the interesting thing about these interim administrations is that they have a great responsibility because it somehow becomes their job to construct a legitimate and lasting sense of sovereignty for the successor state that emerges out of that conflict. This idea is actually at odds with the basic idea of what a state is. Because a state is supposed to be forged by the political will of its people. It's not a prescription that somebody can make for you and hand over to you when it's suitably ready to, now be your state here. Go ahead and have a state and live in it. So is it such a big surprise then that many of these manufactured senses of sovereignty don't last? We are all shocked that, the mission did not create a state that was stable. Because soon after that, they declared a constitutional emergency and the government fell through. And then you have a transitional administration that's struggling to keep the peace. And throughout all of this, you are asking questions on, are you upholding the rule of law? Are any of these institutions in line with their obligations under the rule of law? Not necessarily, right? You have a thick conception of justice, you have a thin conception of justice, and you have somewhere in between this kind of balancing act that states are forced to do in that twilight period of their lives, when you might say that they are the most vulnerable at that time to being broken up again. So, when I thought about how do I critically respond to these mainstream conceptions of transitional justice, it struck me that as someone who is attempting to situate her scholarship in the critical lens of the global south, I have a responsibility to be the voice of that global south. And part of that voice is a sense of deep mistrust, informed by history and informed by our particular engagement with the inequities of history. It's a deep sense of mistrust in the enterprise of empire, the enterprise of institutionalized justice, and a sense of mistrust in anything that appears to be formulaic. And I think the problem with many of the mechanisms that are available in the transitional justice toolkit is that they are formulaic. They require us to set up a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They suggest that we have an authority that serves as an interim administration. They suggest that this authority be competent to hold and carry out free and fair elections until the new government comes into place. And a host of other problematic administrative, a parcel of administrative responsibilities that somebody you don't trust is tasked. So, you should ask at this point, what is the alternative? If the state was able to, sort of go out of conflict into a post-conflict peace on its own, it wouldn't have required this area of law to even exist. If it was possible for states to simply do this, we wouldn't have had transitional justice. The fact is that I recognize that the poverty of the critique, like many other critiques that come from the liminal position of questioning the mainstream, the poverty of the critique is that an alternative is in fact the opposite of what the critique is trying to seek. The critique is attacking the mainstream, but by suggesting an alternative to the mainstream, are we not simply, could we not be accused of suggesting mainstream 2 or a mainstream B? And who is to say that mainstream B is better than mainstream A, right? So really, I think that the limitation of the critical approach is that the limitation is that it cannot realistically suggest a packaged alternative, but the strength of the critical approach, and I think this is why the critical approach is here to stay, is that it's not derived from one set of voices. It's not simply, this mistrust in institutions that I'm trying to parse. The critical approach is as myriad as critiques are. So one could take a feminist critique of transitional justice. One could take a post-colonial critique of transitional justice. One could assume the position of a lat crit position in transitional justice. One could look at transitional justice as a critical study of race and gender. Or one could look at it from the CLS or the Critical Legal Studies School, which is the approach that I am advancing now. The Critical Legal Studies School simply says that in this limited context, that there is some value by simply opposing. That opposition and resistance to mainstream measures are valuable on their own, even if they are not able to suggest a powerful or an articulate alternative to the existing mechanisms. And I think that this is the point at which I will leave off my comments, and I will then open myself up to all of you who are listening in, and I will be happy to take your challenges, comments, critiques, observations, responses, anything that you have for me. Thank you very much.
Hello. Hi, ma'am. That was an amazing and enlightening session. And now I will go further with the questions. We have some really interesting questions from the attendees, and I think you would really be, interested in answering all of them. So the first question, which I would put for you, is from Maitali. She says, what is your opinion on the increase of terrorist activities during the pandemic, either in Afghanistan or India, Pakistan or the Northeast India?
Thank you. Congratulations to Maithili for asking such an insightful question. It shows me at once that your understanding of international criminal law is not limited to those big crimes that I spoke about here, which are genocide and war crimes, but that you're also thinking about the difficult crimes like terrorism. And I think that, well, one of the problems with subversive or anti-establishmentarianist activities that are perpetrated by non-state actors in states whose sovereignty is already prone to destabilization is that they unfortunately have the effect of further destabilizing that state's sovereignty. And this, I think, would have fairly serious repercussions to our continued understanding of what sovereignty means in states where, statehood, identity, and the emancipatory potential, really, of the understanding of sovereign is already under so much attack. That is not to say that a state which is relatively stable can afford this kind of a terrorist threat from non-state actors. It's just that, it's unfortunate that the positioning of these activities appears to coincide with what is already a fairly aggravated time of, public health emergency, etc. One response comes from human rights. You see, when in international human rights law, you have the possibility of declaring, what you could call it, I guess, an emergency under constitutional law, if that's how you wanted to understand it. But you could suspend the working of international human rights treaties and your allegiance to those treaties, citing a public health crisis under the ICCPR as well as in the EU under the European Convention on Human Rights. I don't know if a similar mechanism is available to the states that you have discussed in your question, but what is always open to them is to declare an internal emergency in line with their constitutions. And I think once that kind of gravitas is associated with these subversive activities, the state is then perceived, at least from outside, the state is perceived as having taken a grave view of the situation. And this awareness that the state is perceived to have shown by declaring this constitutional emergency becomes in later years a source of legitimacy for that state's sovereignty. So, I wonder if I'm not sure that that completely responds to what is much deeper conversation that you have indicated, but I think within the constraints of this conversation, these are my thoughts.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering the question. Now we have the next question from Hasib, and he says, how can transitional justice be used to bring closure to the issue of comfort women during World War II?
Thank you for that question. It's a particularly sensitive and difficult question, really, to respond to. You see, well, there have been studies that whose sole purpose is to understand during one particularly brutal conflict, what were the what was the effect of that conflict upon different actors who were part of that conflict. And the comfort women who were part of not simply the Second World War, but also other atrocities that took place ancillary to the Second World War, the Pacific theater of the Second World War, specifically across Southeast Asian countries. They have had a particularly bad time of it because no tribunal and no institutionalized mechanism ever took up their sets of claims as discrete from the rest of the set of claims that they were investigating. Particularly, the crime that they were investigating in the Tokyo Tribunal was aggression. And the sophistication and the nuance of the statute of the Tokyo Tribunal simply didn't permit for understanding these kinds of actors. So I think that in your question you have very maturely brought out what is the silence of transitional justice. I think that the atrocities and the humiliation, I would say, the humiliation suffered by some of the people who, they're victims of that war, and they never received a customized response. This is certainly a failing of the institutionalized mechanism, but more than that, I think that it illustrates very poignantly the gaps of transitional justice. You started your question with the word closure, and I think that one of the prescriptive mainstream words that is associated with transitional justice is closure, because of the potential of transitional justice to redeem a society. And that redemptive idea, right, lies in the fact that it can bring a sense of, you can have a sense of closure when you do a reckoning with your past. And so, the historic trauma gets washed away. I think that might be one way of putting it, is that the idea that, the associations of trauma that you have with your particularly brutal history, once they are reckoned with, you are then strong enough to move on. The president of Rwanda, the post-conflict president, Paul Kagame, who also led the RPF back and took Rwanda back from the Hutu extremist militia, the Interahamwe. When Kagame came back and he tried to establish post-conflict peace in Rwanda, one of the things that was very focal for him was that everything we do is in order to move forward from him. And so he had this tremendous sense that all of this is geared towards preparing our society for the future, that it doesn't help to dwell in the past. Whereas, the example that you have given me of Comfort Women and the particularly brutal gender-based violence and rape and the children that were born of rape that they had to deal with, this became their identity for life, right? Where do you move on from there? And who can you possibly punish, or how can you possibly compensate someone for the loss of an entire identity that has been eclipsed by a war? I had the opportunity in 2016 or 17, I forget which year, but when I was in Bangladesh doing a study of the Bangladeshi War Crimes Tribunal, I met with a scholar in Bangladesh who introduced me to a new kind of brutality. She says that, she told me that, look, Rashmi, the evidence of the Bangladeshi war lives on in the people who are now grown-ups. They are children who were born of the rape of Bangladeshi women by Pakistani soldiers during that war. And the evidence has been destroyed. Of course, everyone makes fun of this tribunal and says, what are you doing? 30 years later, 60 years later, you think you can just reopen the past and have forensic evidence and so forth, that will be enough to launch an investigation? Of course you can't. But you have interesting survivor testimony in the names and faces of those who were not born at the time of the war, but the incident of their birth and the whole story of their lives is that they are evidence of the atrocities that took place. the fact that, you know, in a deeply Islamic society, they don't have a father has problematic repercussions in property law, in family law, in succession, in inheritance, and even in tax laws in Bangladesh. And so, you know, who is to say that who is to say at what point closure comes? Do you have to eradicate 2 generations to close out the living memory of atrocity? I don't know, but thank you for that really beautiful and difficult question.
Thank you, ma'am, for answering the question. Now we have the next question from Sudha. She says that, can you please explain the transitional justice rendered in Afghanistan, Iran, etc., and India's role, if any?
Well, thank you for that question. Hello. Hello. I think I lost you on the connection, Anshu, before you could complete the question. I'm sorry, I only heard a part of that question before your mic closed out. Anshu, I'm not sure if I am audible at this point. So I think maybe let me just respond to that question, assuming that you can hear me. Well, thank you for, I think I only heard half your question, but if I heard it correctly, hello? Right. So, well, I think that I only heard a part of that question, but it appeared to me to be a direct question about what kinds of transitional mechanisms are underway in Afghanistan. Is that the question? If that is the question, then, you know, I would say that, well, there are different accounts of what was the atrocity in Afghanistan and what was the timeline of the atrocity. The mainstream or the popular opinion is that from 1978 to about 2001, Afghanistan experienced at least 3 waves of successively illegitimate governmental institutions that succeeded each other. And during the time that they were in power, not simply so the Soviet invasion, the Mujahideen insurgency, as well as the Taliban rule, they saw a systematic repression of human rights. You saw violations of humanitarian law during this period, including arbitrary detention, you know, rape, enforced disappearances, and so on. During the post-conflict period in Afghanistan, there was a fairly significant role played by the institutions that were put in place by, the United States working with other humanitarian agencies. I'm not aware that India played any key political role at this point, but it could be also my lack of information on this. At least from popular accounts and scholarly accounts of what I have read, I would say that the Afghan reconstruction effort has been so far limited to the documentation phase. And I know that there are many humanitarian agencies and reporting agencies that is led by coalitions of either states or independent international organizations working with states that have produced a tremendous amount of documentation of the atrocities committed by these 3 sets of governments. I also know that the documentation has been shared with policymakers in the current state in Afghanistan, and that civil society organizations are stepping in, and they have a big role in the reconstruction project. but there has not yet been any kind of a judicial reckoning that has been done in Afghanistan. And so I think that in the years to come, one of the things that we can expect is that the toolkit will be unpacked and will be applied to all of these, to the documentation process. And I'm sorry I didn't catch the rest of the question because there was a glitch in the video and you cut out after.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am, for answering the question. And I'm sorry there was some internet issue at my end. Now, the next question is from Kishan, who has two questions for you. So the first one is that should regional confederation and association come out of cultural and traditional inhibitions to facilitate a uniform international legal system unaffected by political pressures? So this is the first one. And the second one is what role do the
Sorry, could you repeat that first question? It was a bit too fast. I didn't catch it.
Yeah, ma'am, it's should regional confederation.
I lost you. I lost the audio again. Anshu, I don't know what you're saying. I can't hear you.
And associations come out of cultural and traditional inhibitions to facilitate. Hello.
Hi, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that at all. Your video was lost. Your audio was lost.
Hear me?
I can hear you now. Could you type the question? I think it might be easier if I. Would you mind
yes,
typing?
I can type the question for you.
Thank you so much. But I think would.
Yes, ma'am, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a type window somewhere here?
Yeah. Yeah, ma'am, on the left side, on the right side, you can see a panel with the questions.
Actually, I don't.
Ma'am, is my voice clear for you now? Can I, is it fine if
I can see, yes, I can see the question also here. Is it the transition in India and Afghanistan? I can't see the next one.
Okay, so ma'am, you just scroll down and you see the questions. The question was from Kishan.
I'm really sorry, Anshu, but it doesn't scroll below this. I don't see the question below that. Sorry, would you mind either copying it and pasting it here or reading it out to me?
Yeah, ma'am, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah, so ma'am, the next question is, do you think tools of transitional justice actually pin down towards a more inquisitorial system of justice?
I think you're talking about inquisitorial.
Yeah, ma'am, that's right.
Okay, so thank you for that question. There was a question that you were talking about regional prejudices or something about culture. I think this is a different one,
right? Yeah, ma'am.
Which one would you like me to answer? So, I mean, I think I'll take the question on inquisitorial justice and the role of transitional justice in facilitating a move from an adversarial system to an inquisitorial system. I think that's a really insightful question, first of all, because it shows me that the person asking the question is looking at the potential of transitional justice, to the potential that it has to really transform the legal system of a country in which you apply it. And one of the, I would definitely say that because many of these truth and reconciliation commissions also function, as commissions of inquiry, because that's the fact-finding stage. Right? So at the documentation period, which is sort of like the beginning of the post-conflict reconstruction, you make an assessment of everything that needs to be done. And if a commission of inquiry has been set up whose job is to investigate atrocities, certainly it plays an inquisitorial role because the members of that team are actively involved in finding the facts of the case, which is a hallmark of the inquisitorial system. So I don't know whether there is much room for, an adversarial way of playing the legal system. In transitional justice, I think it's definitionally inquisitorial. And yeah, I think that's my response.
Okay, thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the answer. So the next question, which we were talking about, the uniform legal system, I'm going to read that to you again. So it says, should regional confederations and associations come out of cultural and traditional innovations to facilitate a uniform international legal system unaffected by political pressures?
Wow, so that's another big and weighty question. I feel the weight of the question in all of the, all of the things that it suggests. Um, as you may have figured out from my talk, the person who asked the question, my view is actually the opposite. I don't think that there is any one universal, one size fits all, harmonized structure that can ever eclipse regional prejudices and the specificities of culture that make a society what it is, that give it identity, that give it distinctiveness. So I see where you are coming. I see where you're coming from with this question. I'm reminded of so many practices that are considered, they are considered terribly morally bankrupt. They are considered problematic. I'm talking about practices that practiced in small groups and societies that are outside of the mainstream. Their food, their habit, their culture, the ways in which they treat their women, especially the way in which they treat their children, the way in which you come of age in those societies, the way in which you traditionally hunt, you traditionally participate as a full member of that society. Now, one of the hallmarks of transitional justice is that it's going to affect everybody in a polity. And when you apply sort of like a bandage to all of it, that bandage is meant to heal everyone on whom it falls. So part of accepting the impositions created upon you by the requirement to come out, speak the truth, talk about what happened. To an extent, of course, that involves overcoming your cultural prejudices, overcoming what would have been your, native or intuitive answer, and trying to fit in to a structure that has been created for you, where you are simply part of that scaffolding, right? It is not to question. And I think the problem with the suggestion is that it removes the possibility of simply opposing it and says, you know what, this doesn't work for me. As a society, I don't think that this is the answer for me to move out of conflict into any kind of lasting peace. Because, what are you trying to achieve? You are not transitioning out of who you were into somebody that the world wants you to be, right? I don't want to reduce this to an identity, to the politics of identity, but really at some level, this is about collective identity being compromised. Because if we were all to subscribe to the idea that there is an emancipatory potential in the institutions, in the mechanisms that transitional justice promises, then we should all set our differences aside and step up to the game and say, I'm going to do this because it's worth it, right? The peace that will come at the end of this is what I'm trying to get. But I don't think that the association of altering your cultural prejudices is really the cost that you should have to pay for peace. So I guess, yeah, this is my response.
response. Now, the next question might be a critical question, and it's from Srika. And she says, can you give some insights on perspectives of transitional justice with respect to Jammu and Kashmir?
Okay, well, that's a tough question, and thank you so much for challenging me in this webinar. I didn't think really that we would go into this question, but in a way, I'm glad you asked it. So there are two ways to respond to your question, and I will attempt to try and at least outline for you what I consider two possible responses. A while back, uh, a colleague brought up the question of whether India is a right case for transitional justice. And I remember being, my main academic problem with that question was that it didn't fit with the idea of, I didn't think of India as being a post-conflict state. And I think that has to do with my own sort of the blinkers that I was wearing, because I said, well, we're a stable sovereign state, and in fact, if you look around us, our neighbors, we are by far the most stable entity in this geographical region. We are kind of the one keeping it together when everyone else around us is falling apart. So if you were to suggest that this is a case for post-conflict reconstruction, I must first concede that there is a conflict which requires reconstruction. And so, for myself, I never got over this definitional dilemma. I could never concede that India is indeed a case fit for transitional justice. But then I tried to, and that would have been the textbook response to you, okay? But to entertain the other side, the difficult proposition, I thought, well, what are some problematic areas in which one might say that really we are in a post-conflict situation? And of course, it's the Armed Forces Special Powers Act that came to mind, and the jurisprudence of it, the abuse of authority. Every day there are, if the press is to be believed, which in itself is a difficult proposition nowadays. But such as it is, if we were to take, even with a pinch of salt, the reports that we have seen of independent civil society organizations, they paint a very different picture from the one that I suggested initially of India being a stable state. In fact, they suggest that there are strong divisive forces that are pulling at India from all directions, and that the idea of India is largely, in our heads. We imagine the stability, we imagine the regional sort of guarantees of peace, etc., that it comes with. But the reality is that India is very much a right case for transitional justice, because even within the framework of a stable society, there exist, tendencies that are, they are fissipatus. They are trying to break away from the center. They are, trying to create a new sense of what it means to be a state. If we entertain those forces, and even if we don't entertain those forces, if we just take a look at the record of violence, I think that it would take a really hardened cynic not to say, not to admit that there is definitely a conflict situation ongoing. But your question is about transitional justice, which again, the answer is that, did that conflict end? Has there been a post-conflict situation? What do we rebuild? If the conflict is ongoing, and the agents and the actors who are responsible for the conflict are still exalted, and violence is still, an everyday occurrence, there has not been, even whether notionally or in reality, There has not been a cessation of the violence. So how do we admit in our imaginations for a post-conflict, right? I mean, of course, it would be quite wishful at this point to say that there is a post-conflict project of rebuilding Jammu and Kashmir. If that were in existence, I think that yes, it would definitely be a situation that is ripe to apply transitional justice tools, but with caution and sensitivity, and mindful of the baggage that post-colonial reconstruction entails, and this version of post-colonial reconstruction probably entails even more sensitivity. Yeah, that's my response.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am. That was beautifully answered. Now the next question is from Gargi, who says, does forgiveness require accountability?
Does forgiveness require accountability? Well, how do I answer that? Let me give you two examples that I think will do a better job of responding to it than I can hope to do. One of them is, in 2015, the New York Times published a photo series. It was a series of stark and black and white photographs of two sets of people. In each photograph, there were two people. And there were many sets of this. You can go online and look for it. You'll find it. I can share a link after this conversation and look for it and send it to you also. What that was to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide. And what those series of photographs had captured, the people in each of those photographs were a victim or a survivor and the perpetrator. So if you saw this as a novice, really, to the transitional justice game, if you just came in and you said, how is this possible? This guy committed, this person probably raped her sister, and the sister died, and here is the surviving sister. 20 years later, she's taken a photograph with the perpetrator where she's holding his hand. And there is a sense of tremendous power and symbolism in those photos, because unless you have visited the mass graves in Rwanda, unless you've tried to sit down, and think about how can you possibly punish a country full of perpetrators. Nobody in Rwanda was untouched by the genocide. Everybody in some way, in some measure, was either a perpetrator or a victim. And so how do you deal with it? How do you move on from that? Jails were not designed as an alternative to housing. They were not alternative housing for the entire population. You can't imprison your whole population and then say, let's move on from here with everybody incarcerated, right? So you have to think creatively. And then you look around at your society and you think, okay, what is the strength of the society? In the Rwandan society, that strength was religion, was community, was a sense of faith in the community justice system known as Gacaca. And because the divisions created by their Hutu and their Tutsi identity, the ethnic identities, were also a very deep part and a real part of the people of not just Rwanda, but also the eastern parts of the Congo and the western parts of Kenya, that entire region. This identity was a deep and personal issue for all of them. And that is why when that identity was the basis of the violence, the source of combating that violence also came from an acceptance of the possibilities of conflict created by that identity. And that is why forgiveness and remorse became a hallmark of the Rwandan post-construction state. Now, it would seem to an outsider that impunity and forgiveness are, they're opposites of each other. Either you punish somebody or you forgive somebody, right? Or by punishing somebody, you then forgive them in your mind because they have received that punishment. So you have been avenged. You feel that you have been avenged by the system. But that's not what happened in these societies. Forgiveness was an alternative to punishment. And that is really difficult to explain through, of course, this medium. It's also difficult for me to understand, as a scholar, as a researcher, having met these people, having spoken with them, I still don't understand. And so there's a sort of, the beauty comes out of I think the inherent fragility of human relationships, but also the extreme power of human relationships to heal. And people always underestimate their own potential for compassion. And when you are put under extreme stress, I think that as a society, the Rwandans dug deep and they found that compassion. And when they found that compassion, it gave them the strength to move on. And they didn't need, the gimmicks of institutionalized justice. They didn't need to see tough prosecutions and people being held accountable, because for them accountability was also at the granular level of seeing the perpetrator. He's next door to you, he's got a farm and he's feeding his chickens. You've seen that guy commit rape, and you've seen him do it 20-25 years ago, and here he is feeding his chickens. So what does the ICTR think they are achieving by punishing some high level government official whom nobody has heard of? The real person on the ground in Rwanda doesn't know this military general who's been charged with genocide and was convicted successfully of it. It's good news for them. They're like, okay, great. The justice story is making sense at a macro level, but at the individual, the deeply personal level, I think that each society has had to deal with the post-conflict reconstruction in ways that were very unique to the collective identity of that society. And that's why you can't prescribe forgiveness. You can't prescribe remorse, because that may not work for all societies. Some societies may be deeply vengeful, and that idea of vengeance may be deeply ingrained in them. It may be part of even their social identity. You can't tell them that, oh, why don't you try forgiveness because it works somewhere else. That would be a ridiculous suggestion. Okay, thanks.
You for the answer. Now, today we have the last question of this webinar, and probably a long one. Okay, so I'm going to read it out to you. So this is, do you think there is a single universal standard of justice across the globe that is actually the Western standard, and every institute, organization, and states are running to achieve the same? The second part says, is there any way in which the standard of justice being propagated by Taliban is acceptable, or is it compatible with other civilizations? Thank you.
Thank you for both of them. I'm very tempted because it's been 1.5 hours. I'm tempted to give you the short answer. The short answer to the first question is no. And the short answer to the second question is yes. But I feel like that would not be doing justice to your question. So I will attempt the long answer. For the first question, I think that you have successfully and succinctly summarized exactly what I've been trying to say, that there is definitely a sense of, well, I think neocolonialism is now a fairly tired word in academia. Everyone uses it, and so it has lost currency. So I'm not going to use it, but it's like, there are definitely senses of familiarity. It sounds familiar. This narrative of saying that there is a Western neoliberal prescriptive idea in which democracy is a value and a good and the only kind of acceptable mechanism of governance, and anything that doesn't fit into that formula must therefore immediately change or face a crisis of legitimacy because it will be held up to the mirror of conforming with those Western neoliberal institutional hegemonic structures, right? This is the idea, but the counter idea is equally seductive. It says that it's esoteric. The Western idea of institution building, of justice that can only be achieved through institutionalized means, and which requires that the crime first be codified, and then there has to be a chapeau, and the chapeau has to have certain elements, and prosecution must prove those elements, and so forth. That is esoteric to the point of it's pedantic, it's pedestrian. What we have is far more sophisticated and nuanced. And very recently, who said this was a new law school, which is an exciting experiment in re-engaging with traditional forms of justice, traditional forms of lawmaking in Bhutan. And there is this new law school which is very inward looking and at the same time forward looking, because they have one foot firmly in history. They are not trying to dismantle Bhutanese traditional methods of dispute settlement or arriving at consensus or resolving conflict. They are simply trying to introduce elements of the existing institutionalized mainstream to that framework and try and educate the scholars there about what are the differences between the two, and which needs to adapt to which. So that's the refreshing change, right? And I wish I could say it was a trend, but I think it's very much an outlier. At the moment, it's an outlier to the mainstream. But the answer to your question is that no, of course there isn't. There isn't one form of justice that should be universally accepted. But when I say that, I realize that I'm engaging with the normative proposition. The normative proposition is not the problem here. The problem here is that our idea, the epistemological idea of justice that we understand, the gnosis of it comes from the episteme, and the episteme is the mainstream, right? So you have to be a complete liminal. You have to sit on the fringes of that mainstream and beat your drum and keep shouting your resistance to have a fighting chance of raising some kind of opposition to that mainstream. Whether that opposition will carry or not, and whether in the end you will simply be a crit that criticized without having an alternative, that's what the academe is for. That's what we sit and decide here. Your second question was about, remind me again. What was the second part of the question? It was about whether there's any legitimacy to the institutions of governance and the mode of governance practiced by Taliban. So if I had to be true to context, if I had to be true to the context that I have laid out here, I would say, well, it depends on those who are the subjects of that governance. And if there is a sense of internal legitimacy that they have endowed that government with, then it would be a miscarriage of understanding what sovereignty is to question that. At the same time, I'm mindful that we live in a space of modern international law, where of course we question it, because we question it because we think we know what's best for those who are governed by Taliban. We know what they want, we know what they need, and of course we've known it all along. And this has been the emancipatory role of international law through humanitarian interventions. this is the humanitarian part of it, right? This is the cause that gives you space to erode that state sovereignty and enter it for yourself and see what kinds of travesties of justice are being carried out there. From what little I do know, which is documentary and anecdotal, I have no personal or field experience with Afghanistan, though I would love to gain some in my professional career. But I think that there is a certain hypocrisy in the way that scholarship has always looked at those who are different. If one has to be quite reductionist, it comes down to the question of othering. Who are we to pass judgment on the preferences, whether they are cultural preferences, food preferences, or governance preferences of others? And I realize that this is a provocative response. I'm not sure that this is, in fact, I'm quite sure that this is not how I feel about it. But I think that the job of academia is to provoke. And so one of the last thoughts that I'm going to leave you with is that this is very much a part of the culture of othering. And so if you are squirming in your seats, then my job here is done. All right, thanks for the question.
So thank you for this amazing webinar and a series of very critical questions. Also, I would like to ask you to give an end note for the attendees after this webinar on, transitional justice, which is actually a new concept for a lot of us in India. So thank you, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much to Ms. Gupta, who has been moderating this session. I'm grateful for her masterly leadership in leading me through the questions. And thank you so much to all of the attendees who have taken the trouble to, provoke me and challenge me with such difficult and complex questions. And I am left with the sense that there is definitely a lot of scope for scholarship and research in transitional justice, not only in India, but also in the sense that this is the subject of my generation. You see, because this transitional justice was born as a discipline around the same time that I was. So it is as old as I am. And in a sense, it belongs to my generation. It is to us to ask the difficult questions and to try and make sense of this discipline. And that's why, apart from public international law and international criminal law, this is one of my pet areas in which I keep myself up to date, and I try to think and write and produce scholarship in this area. Thank you so much for your time and attention. I'm very grateful to the admissions office for having invited me to deliver this webinar. And I hope that it has been of some use to those of you who have taken the time to attend it. Thank you.
Thank all the attendees who were throughout the session, and thank you for amazing questions for us. And stay safe, stay home, and looking forward to have more of such webinars where you can interact with our amazing faculties. Thank you so much.